It's one of the most broken cards in Magic's history. And in Magic player fashion, when it was first released, players thought it was the worst card printed in Ice Age. Even the trading card game magazines at the time were rating it 1 out of 5 stars. But a year later, it would dominate the Pro Tour. Necropotence revealed something fundamental about Magic systems that players had yet to discover. So let's talk about the history of Necropotence, its impact on Magic, and how it can help us learn how to make better games.
Distraction makers.
Necropotence was released in Ice Age, which came out in June of 1995. And the text on the card is different than the way that they would write the card text today, so let's go over the Oracle text. Necropotence costs 3 black. It's an enchantment, and it says, skip your draw step. Whenever you discard a card, exile that card from your graveyard. Pay 1 life, exile the top card of your library face down. Put that card into your hand at the beginning of the next end step. Before we get into the power of Necropotence and the specifics about the card, we need to go back in time to before players understood the power of Necropotence. So back in 1995, Magic player Brian Weissman had developed what could be considered Magic's first meta deck. It was called the deck. By today's standards, we would call a control deck. It attempted to lock your opponent down and make basically dwindle all of your opponent's resources till they had nothing, and then beat them with a single Sarah Angel. And before this time period, Magic players didn't really have any concept of what the idea of card advantage meant. This term was actually coined by Weissman himself, and he describes it as every spell that trades favorably, swords to plowshares, killing an enchanted creature, or moat neutralizing multiple creatures, is equivalent to gaining an extra turn. The deck dominated pre-Pro Tour Magic, brought Brian Weissman to win 5 sanctioned tournaments, and his best performance was at a 2-day event where he only lost a single game. So not a match, 1 game. And soon after he sort of was successful with this deck archetype, there would be a card that would take the idea of card advantage to its most extreme. So the Necro deck is framed as an offshoot of the Handelman School. The Handelman School favored offensive strategies that had anti-card advantage, what we might consider a tempo or attrition strategy today. So basically I'm going to make my opponent discard cards while I'm attacking them. Maybe I'll counter their spells. Generally speaking, at the time, this was probably more in the attrition style. And this strategy was around at the time when the deck was performing its best, but it hadn't quite broken through in the same way. And once the Type 2 format was introduced and decks lost specific cards like Ancestral Recall, Time Twister, Wheel of Fortune, and Brain Geyser. But one more thing had to fall into place. In January of 1996, Black Vice was restricted, which cleared the path for Necropotence to become dominant. By the spring of 1996, players had realized the power of Necropotence, and 3 distinct strategies of sort of Necro deck began to emerge that all used Necropotence as their card advantage engine. There was Classic Necropotence, which used Necropotence to its greatest effect, rather than merely adding Necropotence to a previously constructed deck. This played cards like Soulburn and Jalum Tome. This is also what you would consider probably the most classic style of Necro deck. And then there was sort of the weenie version, aggro-ish strategy that used Necropotence to continue to fill your hand with cards. This was a deck that existed before Necropotence became popular and was modified by adding 4 Necropotence in, Bad Moons, and a ton of aggressive black creatures. The third was an attrition type strategy, which only played 1 Necropotence in the main deck initially. It focused on a constrained resource strategy that we sort of talked about in a previous video, where it was looking to hinder your opponent from being able to play much of anything. Meanwhile, it was drawing its own cards with Necropotence. It's also played 4 Strip Mines, 4 Icequakes, and 4 Hymn to Torox. Something that was important here is that this deck did not play any Drain Lives. And there was a point in time where a player that was working on this type of strategy, somebody cast a Drain Life on them and then used that life, those extra life points that they gained, to draw a bunch of cards. And players at the time coined this Drain Geysering, which is a reference to Brain Geyser. The wheels were starting to turn and things were starting to click into place. Using your life as a resource, trading your life points for card advantage, was something that fundamentally breaks the game of Magic. So when Necro deck sort of reached its final form, eventually red had been added, and Mark Justice took this deck to a 2nd place finish at Worlds, where he faced off against a white weenie deck that had 12 different creatures that had protection from black. As you can imagine, the match did not go well for him. He lost 0-3. So in the aftermath of what was coined the Black Summer of 1996, Wizards of the Coast took action. Hymn to Torok and Strip Mine were restricted. And this is kind of interesting, right? Because Necropotence is actually probably the problem here, in that it's interesting to see Wizards either not wanting to take action against such an iconic card that had created several different types of archetypes, but as those archetypes began to coalesce, they seemed to want to hit the cards around Necropotence before banning Necropotence itself. Even after these cards were restricted at Pro Tour Dallas in 1996, Necropotence wins again. Paul McCabe created a Creature Light Lake of the Dead build and takes first. And then Eric Lara designs a black, red, white Necrolisk that Randy Buehler won Pro Tour Chicago with. And a lot of these names might sound familiar because most of them ended up working for Wizards of the Coast. And Necropotence started to become so dominant that players started to play other cards just to find Necropotence. Things like Demonic Consultation. With the introduction of red, they played cards like Firestorm, where you could sort of convert life points into cards and then cards into damage. So a card that went from being completely undervalued by Magic players in traditional fashion, to being one of the most broken cards in the game that ended up banned in Legacy, restricted in Vintage. Commander is basically the only place where Necropotence is still able to be played to its fullest today. So what's the lesson that players finally learned that clicked things into place for Necropotence to become dominant? This comes back to the idea of drain geysering, right? They realized that, oh, okay, interesting. We can convert our life points into a resource to draw cards, and those cards are giving us a greater advantage and ability to win the game. But there's another thing interesting that happens with Necropotence, especially with constrained resource strategies, is that if you are paying a bunch of life points to draw more cards, you're drawing cards that's stopping your opponent from being able to play threats to reduce your life total. And so this frees up more life points for you to use for card advantage. And ultimately, the only point of damage in the game of Magic that matters is the one that takes you from 1 life to 0. Necropotence, over the course of the years, has even revealed more interesting interactions that players didn't really understand at the time. And some of this has to do with the way that the card has been written, like the templating of the card gives some strange hooks for different types of interactions that weren't really intended by the card's design, I don't think. And we can see this shift in design philosophy when we go to the card Necrodominance, which we'll talk about in a minute. The amount of life that you can pay is up to you, right? You can use Necropotence as just a way to sort of refill your hand back up to 7, and then you're not discarding anything at the end of your turn. Or you can spend as many life points as you want up until, the point where you would die to dig through your deck to attempt to grab a combo piece or a way to win the game. And we see this play pattern in CEDH all the time, that basically, okay, well, if I have a Necropotence in play, does that mean I'm winning the game? Or is this a value Necro where I'm just sort of refueling my hand to make sure that I have interaction against the other players? And the other thing is that the cards, when you discard them, they do actually hit your graveyard, because the way that Necropotence is worded, it says that when a card would be put in your graveyard, exile it instead, which means that there's a trigger that's put on the stack that says this card has hit your graveyard and now it will be exiled. And that means that you have the ability to respond before that card is actually exiled. And so you can do things like discard a card and reanimate it at instant speed without it actually being exiled yet. And the last sort of rules intricacy here that's really interesting with Necropotence is that it is a way to create a trigger in your cleanup step. And this is like real in the weeds. The way that Magic's turn structure works is that, you go through your main phase combat, second main, and then you go to end of turn, and then the last thing that you do is go to your cleanup step. And this is distinctly separate from your end of turn step. And it's just a step where you're supposed to discard down to 7 cards. But because Necropotence creates a trigger when you discard a card that hits your graveyard, means it must be exiled, the rules of the game, you have actually ended your turn, but your turn ends up not being over because you've discarded a card and a trigger has been put on the stack, which then gives you the ability to respond. So effects that end at the end of turn will have ended, but your turn isn't actually over. So the interaction we see most often in CEDH with this is somebody will play a silence effect against you that says you can't play spells for the rest of the until the end of turn, right? And so then you end up passing to your end step where that effect falls off. Now you can play spells because you're past the end of turn step. You're in your cleanup step. But because Necro puts a new trigger on the stack when a card is put into your graveyard, if you drew up to 8 cards, you discard one of those cards to clean up. That then creates a trigger and a window now for you to play more spells again. Necropotence would go on to inspire a lot of other cards that are designed for Magic the Gathering. Mark Rosewater designed one that attempted to fix Necropotence called Yawgmoth's Bargain, which is banned in basically every format, including Commander, but Necropotence isn't for some reason. Yawgmoth's Bargain costs 4 generic mana and 2 black. It's an enchantment. It says skip your draw step, pay 1 life, draw a card. I think Mark's attempt here is basically just, well, how do we cost Necropotence accurately? What kind of a mana cost should this card actually have? And Yawgmoth's Bargain was still too cheap at 6 mana. The ability to trade life for cards in, I think, any resource management, any trading card game really, but anything that has something like card advantage, to be able to exchange a resource that you have a lot of for one that is more finite, life, starting with 20, turning it into cards, starting with 7, but those cards being able to be the thing that wins you the game, that idea unconstrained, I think, is just generally broken across the board. So the most successful card that was inspired by Necropotence is probably Phyrexian Arena. Now the game has been power crept to the point where Phyrexian Arena is just really not good enough in almost any format. I think it's even in standard right now, and I don't think it sees play. I think that generally speaking, in terms of Magic's power level, Phyrexian Arena being a playable card is probably the power level the game wants to be at. Phyrexian Arena is 1 generic mana and 2 black. It's an enchantment and says, at the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. The idea of exchanging your life total, using your life as a resource to draw cards, is present with Phyrexian Arena, but it's limited, obviously, to one life, 1 card per turn, which I think is definitely the most fair version of this effect. And the most interesting one to talk about now is the most recent homage to Necropotence, which is Necrodominance, that was printed in Modern Horizons 3. And oddly, I think this has seen a bit of play, but not a ton. We do see it in some CEDH decks, but we also have seen it, I think, in some modern decks, but generally speaking, it's not quite to the high enough power level that you would want it to be for it to see play. Might be seeing some play in like Storm decks and Legacy or something. I feel like there's something else. Let me know in the comments if you know where Necrodominance is actually seeing play. Necrodominance costs 3 black mana. It is a legendary enchantment. It says skip your draw step. At the beginning of your end step, you may pay any amount of life. If you do, draw that many cards. Your maximum hand size is 5. If a card or token would be put into your graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So notably, this is a legendary enchantment, which is a little bit strange because you would think that you probably only need 1 of these in play, right? There's not a whole lot of benefit to having multiples. But Aaron Forsyth, in his article about Necrodominance, says there is a benefit for having multiples in play, most notably when you pair it with cheap instants that can gain you life. Soul Spike from Cold Snap being the biggest potential offender. You could let 1 Necrodominance trigger resolve, pay a bunch to draw a bunch, and then pitch several cards to a Soul Spike or 2, then refill again with the second one. This is a problem specific to Necrodominance that wouldn't really be a factor with Necropotence, is that if you could have 2 Necrodominance in play, you would get the ability to pay a bunch of life twice. The next limitation is they made it so that your maximum hand size is 5. Given that you can refill your hand at will, how big your hand is allowed to be is a fine knob to turn to adjust the power level of the card. This also means that you could play a card that makes it so you have no maximum hand size after you've played the Necrodominance, which would create a new timestamp, meaning that the new fact that says you have no maximum hand size overrides the fact that Necrodominance says your hand size is 5. And finally, the big one is that the cards never hit your graveyard. And this is just a change in templating to make sure that it's not a triggered ability. It's just a static ability that says if anything, if a card or a token would go into your graveyard, it's exiled instead. And this prevents all those things that I was talking about, where you'd have that sort of instant speed ability to respond to the thing being in your graveyard. This also means that Necrodominance does not pair as well with something like Underworld Breach, where if you can play everything at instant speed, you can Underworld Breach out and have a win attempt on the end of your turn, like I was saying before, without any of the stuff being exiled. You can respond with all those triggers being put on the stack. Oh, and one more thing is that the Necrodominance does actually draw cards. In the article, Necropotence doesn't, right? It sets them aside and puts them in your hand, exiles them, and then puts them in your hand. This is something that Aaron Forsyth brings up in his article that he wrote about Necrodominance. I'll link that in the description. But this is something he brings up as a potential thing to combo with Sheldred of the Apocalypse to make her ability actually trigger and gain you life when you draw cards, which works great with Sheldred. The problem is that it works really poorly with Orcish Bowmasters. So the game design side of things, what does this teach us about resource management? And I think mostly it teaches us that having the ability to convert resources in an unconstrained way, especially converting them to something as powerful as cards in a card game, is just a broken ability. The same is probably true with mana, so something like Channel, or even the new VV Onatir that was printed. He's limited to once per turn, but like it still doesn't cost you anything to activate his ability, and you could like flicker him and do it again. Like there's ways to get around the once per turn. Generally speaking, these types of things should be limited, whether that's limited by a cost that you must pay, like a mana cost, or a creature needing to be tapped. In the case of Phyrexian Arena, it's just hard limited to once, like one card, one life per turn. When you allow unconstrained resource conversions, you end up limiting the number of sub-games that get played. And I've brought this up before, where the problem really with power creep or with sort of explosive gameplay generally is that if you can skip past the normal cadence of the resource acquisition in the game, you can effectively shrink the game down to a single sub-game because you can get to those cards that win you the game immediately. And what that means is that the feeling of having a back and forth game with your opponent is reduced down to the do you have it or not style of play, where I'm putting a win attempt on the stack. The question is whether or not you can stop that in some way, usually with a counterspell. And if you can't, then you lose the game. The game Exploding Kittens is actually like a great example of this type of gameplay. And I think there it kind of works because that's sort of the gimmick of the game is that, all right, well, I'm trying to set it up so that you draw the Exploding Kitten. And when you do, you lose the game. But then there's a diffuse card. And that's exactly the play pattern we're talking about, where it can feel very high stakes until you realize that so much of it is just based on randomness, right? It's not based on like an accumulation of different decisions that leads to sort of this, what feels like an inevitable outcome or a satisfying outcome, where you can have this back and forth where if your opponent is presenting a threat that over the course of time would lose you the game, you can, in that instance, kind of use your life as a resource to absorb some of that damage in an attempt to find an out to that strategy. And then once you do, now you can put your opponent back in that position, attacking them, getting their life points down, and maybe it swings back the other direction, maybe it doesn't, right? But you want that back and forth exchange, right? It's interesting because there's so many heuristics that come from that type of interaction where we have things like who's the beatdown, which means that this is a positional heuristic that basically says who is in the position that if things didn't change, they would win the game. That's effectively who the beatdown is. We actually had a conversation in the Discord about this a little bit because somebody was like, is the beatdown the person getting beat down or is the beatdown the person who's doing the beating down? The term coined by Mike Flores is describing the beatdown as the person who is doing the beating down, right? You are the person who is winning the game, but it's more about understanding the position that you're in. And if you are in the winning position, you put your foot on the gas to close the game out. And if you're in the control or sort of losing position, you need to find something to stop your opponent from beating you. And this heuristic is effectively eliminated when you're playing the style of one sub-game type gameplay, right? One game of do you have it or not? It's very clear who the beatdown is. It's very clear who needs to have an answer. And that's it, right? You either have it or you don't. And the other thing is, like, I think we have to be very careful about resources that players start the game with, right? In Magic, the resource that you start the game with the most of is actually cards in your library, but you also have a lot of life. Like you have 20 life. And at the exchange of one life per card, right? That rate is way too effective. We could look at like, okay, well, what if it's 5 life per card? Is that effective, right? We instead of making the enchantment itself cost 6 mana in the case of Yawgmoth's Bargain, and the effect still being pay 1 life, draw a card, we could look at like, okay, well, how many life points would it take for it to be on rate for what it should be worth to be able to draw a card? If it was 5 life, would players pay 5 life to draw a card? I think it depends on the format. In Commander, you probably would. Which brings me to my other point, which is that if we are modifying the rules to the game, we need to understand how these set points in the game work, right? Magic set points, you have 20 life, you have 60 cards in your library, you have 7 cards in your opening hand. These are sort of in game design, we call them set points that the rest of the game is balanced around. And Commander decided that they would change the set point of life. On a surface level, makes sense, right? They're trying to alleviate some of the pressure from aggressive strategies. That's one of the reasons why games would not get to the later higher mana cost cards, is because if the early game is too aggressive, you have lost the game before you have the ability to cast those bigger spells. And so at face value, you would say, well, let's just double the life totals. That'll make the games go twice as long, and you can get to those higher cost, the higher mana cost cards. But when we look at CEDH, we can see that that is just fundamentally not true. You are also doubling a resource pool. And there's a lot of cards in Magic that allow players to spend life as a resource to get some kind of advantage. Necropotence being the primary example of exchanging life for a different type of resource. And the flip side of this too is that it's made the life totals so winning the game through attacking. It's created so much resistance to this thing that I think they were trying to achieve, which is that we want these battle cruiser style gameplay patterns. But it didn't disincentivize the types of strategies that win the game through like a 2-card combo, right? This is Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation. This is Underworld Breach, Brain Freeze, Lion's Eye Diamond, right? This is how almost all CEDH games are won or lost at this point. The idea of doubling life totals to make the game be a more battle cruiser style of play is just fundamentally flawed, right? It didn't work. And so instead, they've had to try to sort of say, well, it's supposed to be a casual format, and you play it as a casual format, and then that way, that means that it will be the battle cruiser style of play pattern that we wanted it to be. And that's just, I don't know. It's frustrating. It's frustrating, and I just wish that there had been a different solution to try to get that battle cruiser style of play. All right, so to wrap things up, Necropotence, one of the most fascinating cards in Magic. Similar to there's the Train Heist movie, right, where you're watching it and you're like, I don't understand why this movie is good. I don't understand, because it's an old black and white movie. And you're like, well, this is the first movie where they realized that they could make a cut in the movie and cut somewhere else, and audiences would follow, right? They would understand the story still. Necropotence in that way is the first time players realized that using your life total as a resource was a winning strategy in Magic the Gathering. Well, that was a fun trip down memory lane. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. If you want to continue the conversation, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.